This is the opening of the Testament of Dr. Mabuse, as envisioned by Fritz and editor Konrad von Molo in 1933. However, this is not how most audiences saw this film for many decades thereafter. Hello, my name is David Callett, and I'm going to walk you through the three faces of Dr. Mabuse to help explain the major differences between the von Molo cut and its two most prominent alternate editions. As I described on the commentary track to the main feature, this version was embargoed by the Nazi authorities and went unscreened until after the war. From 1933 until the 1950s, the only way to see the Testament of Dr. Mabuse was the alternate French-language version prepared by Lothar Wolff. During the early days of the sound era, before the practice of dubbing and subtitling foreign language movies fully evolved, one of the solutions to the language problem was to actually film a second version of the picture on the same sets using a translated screenplay enacted by a secondary foreign language cast. This was such a wildly expensive and time-consuming approach, those filmmakers who chose to do this tended to make only one alternate version in the target language of the most important foreign market. As we can see from this direct comparison, Lothar Wolff and Konrad von Molo are making different editorial choices. But in the case of this opening sequence, they're working with the same footage. Aside from the obvious difference that one version is in German and the other has a different cast speaking French, the principal differences between these two editions will be in the editorial philosophy, not in the directing of the film that took place on the set. Fritz Lang was fluent in French and personally directed both versions. Note that actor Karl Meixner, who plays Hofmeister, has not been replaced in the French edition. He too was bilingual and could perform his lines in French and German equally well as we see here.
Il s'agit d'une affaire fantastique, une piste. Je voudrais lui prouver ma réhabilité. Je tiens une piste. Enfin, aujourd'hui, ils ont failli me régler. Je n'ose plus traverser la rue. Ils me guettent partout.
For the first 2 decades of its life, only the secondary French-language version was available. It is the Lothar Wolff cut that first played in the U.S. in 1942, subtitled in English and distributed as The Last Will of Dr. Mabuse, a title that nicely brought into play both of the meanings of the English word will. Roughly 10 years later, the Testament of Dr. Mabuse returned to the U.S. in a new version called The Crimes of Dr. Mabuse. For this variant, writer Leo Ketcher and his editor Greg Tallis took the footage from the German edition, rescued from the rubble of war-torn Berlin, and crafted from it a 75-minute cut dubbed in English. Right from the opening scene, it was clear that the American version intended to blunt the edges of the original's ambiguity and focus its dreamlike mystery into a more straightforward, audience-friendly thriller.
From the rubble of war came stories, some hideous, some fantastic. This is one such story, gathered from records found in bomb-torn Europe. It tells of the natural and the supernatural, of men and of spirits which once were men. We do not know if the story is true. We do say, however, that according to the records, it happened. It begins in a German city, the year 1939, the place a counterfeiting plant.
The first major change wrought by the American cut is the complete removal of the first scene between Kent and Lily. Instead, Tallis cuts directly from the ghostly Mabuse in his cell to Dr. Crom reassembling Mabuse's writings.
A great many pages today, Doctor.
Yes. Thanks. He doesn't look too well today, so keep a constant check on him. If there's the slightest change in his condition, you must let me know at once.
Certainly, Doctor.
Dr. Cram, if you wish, you can wait in here for Dr. Baum. He should be back shortly.
Meanwhile, I'll look for that book. Thank you. Not here. Maybe on the desk. Oops, what a mess.
Clearly, the American version has little time for the romantic subplot and prefers to foreground the connection between Mabuse and Baum.
Kombinierte Spritze, damit er zur Ruhe kommt. Jawohl, Herr Professor.
The French version also hacks away at the Kent-Lily subplot, and while their first scene has not been totally omitted, it has been gutted. Only the Conrad von Molo version includes the flashback to their first meeting and gives any context to Kent's ambivalence about his criminal life. It's an interesting question why the French version differs at all in its content, since Fritz Lang directed it. But remember that the French version only exists because producer Seymour Nebenzahl felt it was a wise investment to enhance international sales. The definitive version of the movie was the German one, and Lang worked with Conrad von Molo directly on the post-production process. Meanwhile, Lothar Wolff worked on his version 545 miles away from Lang, expressly contracted to make a shorter version suited to foreign tastes. Fritz Lang and the German film industry as a whole made very long movies that foreign exhibitors needed to butcher to fit into the shorter program times they required. The whole point of making the French export version was to obviate this problem and start off with a trimmed-down version of the film. Wolff did this by cutting much of the Kent-Lily scenes and by using shorter transitions overall. Lang's relationship to the American cut is much harder to pin down. The year before Crimes of Dr. Mabuse was made, Nebenzahl produced an American remake of M, directed by Joseph Losey. Lang was infuriated, and his intense resentment of the American M is well documented. However, he never once mentioned the American recut of Mabuse. It could be that Lang was unaware of it, or that he'd given his blessing to it, or that he'd used up all his fury on M and was simply too tired to continue railing against Nebenzahl. Or, and I think this is the more likely answer, he didn't much mind the recutting of the film so long as they duly acknowledged it was his.
I suppose he's calling from a bar like old times.
Leo Ketcher's screenplay for the English dubbing also emphasized, and at times altered, the anti-Nazi sentiment that Lang had always claimed for the film. Some of the changed dialogue was trivial, such as this early scene with Lohmann. In the European versions, Lohmann is on his way to the opera when he's called by disgraced ex-policeman Hofmeister, who had been discharged for accepting a bribe. The American version goes like this.
Strange world, eh, Miller? This Hofmeister. I remember when he was appointed to the force. He was a student at the police academy. He was smart. I thought he had a feel for the work. I was wrong, but yet, you know, I still think that he would have made a good detective, but he hit the bottle. It was all because of that chippy. What a come down.
Homicide, Office of Inspector Lohmann. You've got to let me talk to him. It's very important. I swear it's very important. Inspector, he's desperate. You must talk to him.
Why the devil didn't I leave for the prize fight?
More importantly, Ketcher never misses an opportunity to insert references to Mabuse's fascist ideology.
Seems you're beginning to think of yourself apart from this organization. You have no existence except as my tool. The individual has no being except insofar as he is part of the machine. The individual is nothing. The machine is everything. If you should ever again forget this, it will be necessary for me to destroy you. The same warning applies to all within our group. They're nothing. The organization and its leader are all that count. Never forget that the leader alone is important.
Only I knew his greatness. The superb mentality we lost at the moment when Dr. Mabuse died. He was a man who knew this world was doomed, and he offered us salvation. He knew the average man was unfit to govern himself. He knew that only a Superman could bring order to this rotten world. He was going to prove the power of the Superman. He was the Superman who alone could save us. The one man who could build, could create from the ruins, the chaos that fools call democracy.
You speak of Mabuse the criminal?
Of Mabuse the genius!
In the German original, Lohmann merely tasks his assistant to place a phone call. In the American version, Ketcher manages yet another reference to Mabuse's Hitlerian qualities.
Remember him? He thought he was going to be dictator of the world.
However, for all this, Ketcher makes a clumsy misstep that undermines his own efforts. Remember the opening narration.
It begins in a German city. The year 1939, the place a counterfeiting plant.
When Baum then describes Mabuse in this way,
What Mabuse writes are plans. Plans in which he foresees a magnificent future world controlled by men different from our present rulers.
Ketcher sets up Mabuse as an antagonist to the prevailing German government of 1939, which was a Nazi state headed by Adolf Hitler. Comparing the French and German versions makes it easy to see how rigidly Lang circumscribed his actors' performances down to the minutest detail, and how the actors still made significant contributions within those limitations.
Satisfait, Monsieur le Commissaire?
Monsieur le professeur, une question un peu bizarre. Aucun doute sur l'identité?
Aucun doute, Monsieur le Commissaire.
Leider nein, Herr Kommissar. Leider ist es nur allzu sicher, dass dieser Tote hier Mabuse ist. Oder war. Leider.
Notice the stiff, overbroad gesturing of Oskar Bareggi and Otto Wernicke in the German version, and how those exact same mannerisms also appear in the performances by French actors Jim Giraud and Tommy Bourdelle. The French Inspector Lohmann has none of the earthy, guttural, hard-nosed qualities that Wernicke displays. Wernicke's Lohmann is a real piece of work, and it's easy to see why the underworld fears him. Jim Giraud, however, is a far more avuncular fellow, and his one-dimensional portrayal fails to convince when his scenes like this one have Lohmann as a two-faced, conniving character. Tommy Bourdelle, though, is excellent as the French Dr. Baum. Not only is he a dead ringer for Oskar Bareggi, but he has all the right authoritarian, self-important blusteriness the role calls for.
Personne au monde ne sait. Quel cerveau prodigieux.
Here we have Bourdelle face-to-face with Rudolf Klein-Rogge, and the only example of dubbing in the French cut. Lang obviously couldn't replace Klein-Rogge with a French Mabuse. He was the star, after all. He was Dr. Mabuse. But unlike Karl Meixner, Klein-Rogge was not bilingual, and so his lines, thankfully he did not have many, were dubbed. As Tommy Bourdelle faces Dr. Mabuse, it's fun to note that Bourdelle is the one actor to have appeared in both a Mabuse movie and a Fantomas movie. Fantomas was the French supercriminal who provided some direct inspiration for the creation of the character of Mabuse, and whose adventures in serialized thrillers by director Louis Feuillade provided some direct inspiration for the development of Fritz Lang's own brand of cinema. In 1932, Hungarian director Paul Fehos helmed a revival of Fantomas with Tommy Bourdelle as super cop Detective Juve. The American version of this scene recuts the opening to include additional shots of the masks in Baum's office. Talus's focus on the masks emphasizes the idea that Baum is wearing Mabuse's mask and vice versa. Talus also adds some eerie music, further pushing the thriller aspects of the film to the foreground.
The human-animal man can always be frightened into absolute submission. He fears whatever is beyond his simple mind. He cringes from violence and destruction in case these might overwhelm him. He places a high value on his useless life. He even regards himself as an individual with free will. Actually, he does not exist as an individual. It must be controlled by the human.
Mass wild extermination, meaningless crimes of violence, horror beyond what is regarded as civilization are weapons for the Superman. By using these, he gains control of a group, an army, or a nation, and the stupid individual does as the Superman bids him do. This individual ceases to exist, and his catchwords, with which he had fooled himself. Democracy, equality, liberty lose their meaning, and he no longer trusts in them. That is the moment when he turns to the Superman. So, the moment has come, and now is the time for action.
By the time we get to Kent and Lily's big scene together, little of them has been seen in either of the alternate versions. In fact, this is the first time Lily has been seen at all in the US version. The French version has sacrificed all the surrounding context for this scene, omitting the explanation why a decent man like Kent got involved with Mabuse in the first place, and removing the scene in which he wrote her the letter that she refers to here. The French version also suffers the inevitable compromises of a lesser cast. The German gangsters, played by such great character actors as Theo Lingen, Rudolf Schundler, and Oskar Hooker, seem like real people who've made a life for themselves in the margins of a decaying society. The French crooks, by contrast, are rather unthreatening goofballs.
Avec cette... plus calme là-dedans. Avec ce beau fric, ils achèteront de l'opium, de la coco, de l'héroïne, et ils distribueront tout ça pour rien. Ordre duchesse, distribuer du poison, en distribuer beaucoup, partout. Et dans quel but, je te le demande? Quel est le... Ne perds pas de vue, vos petites.
All three versions of the film end in the same way, following an ambiguously circular logic of a nightmare, with the eternal struggle of good versus evil reduced to a confusing moral miasma. So I, too, will end at what should be the beginning, an introduction. Hello and goodbye collapsed into a single moment.
Gestatten Sie, dass ich mich vorstelle. Mein Name ist Mabuse. Dr. Mabuse.
Permettez-moi de me présenter. Mabuse. Docteur Mabuse.
Permit me to introduce myself. My name is Mabuse. Dr. Mabuse.
Mabuse?